Like any strong and bold design, the PS5 divides opinion. Some people love its futuristic sci-fi look, while others are far less complimentary, likening it to a cream and chocolate biscuit or even some late 2000s internet routers. I personally quite like it, enough even to make a fully brass version, but I definitely see some drawbacks, particularly in its awkward looking horizontal orientation, which, let's face it, most people will be using under their TV. And wow, it looks pretty ugly like that. So it's time for a redesign, and by the end of it we'll be left asking ourselves, that's a PS5. Let's get to it. Like I found with the brass PS5 build, disassembling it is pretty easy, but unlike last time, the goal here is to strip out everything related to the original casing, leaving just the core of the unit. Despite the PS5's bulky reputation, its internal workings are actually remarkably compact, and would almost be as thin as a laptop if it weren't for the very necessary cooling heatsink. As it doesn't fit flat on a surface, however, the first thing to do is level it off using a few hexagonal PCB pillar supports, along with a few washers here and there to fine-tune it. This actually works out pretty well, as the power supply too can be held securely to the main unit by screwing down through it into these pillars using some long screws, making the unit ready to be mounted onto some kind of base plate. While it's possible to use a variety of materials here, I'm in an experimental mood, so my plan is to use some real carbon fibre sheeting for this. Carbon fibre is essentially layered sheets of woven crisscrossing carbon fibres bonded together with a strong resin. This makes it super lightweight and very strong, hence its reputation for being used in sports cars and the like. These amazing properties aren't necessary in my use case here, of course, but my motivation for using it is simply that it looks really nice, and should contrast beautifully with the other material I'm going to be incorporating into the build in just a few minutes. Anyway, to get this trimmed down to the right size, I'm going to mark my cut line and then cover it in tape to prevent any scratches on its surface during the cutting process. While carbon fibre is relatively easy to cut through, it can be left with ugly chips on the cut edge when using something like a jigsaw, so instead I'm going to be using a router, which will cut it very cleanly. This is definitely a job for doing outside though, as the dust given off by carbon fibre during any cutting is definitely not something that you want to be breathing in or even introducing into an internal environment. And I'd really recommend caution against you guys using it for projects at all unless you take proper precautions, like good dust management, wearing a proper respirator and gloves as well, as the dust tends to embed itself into skin and takes a couple of weeks to get flushed out. Anyway, as you can see, the router has made a super neat job of this, with nice rounded front corners thanks to some sanding, and a hole for the fan. To lock in the edge fibres though, it's a good idea to seal it with a thin wipe of epoxy, which adds back the contrast as well. Now as you can see, I've also made various holes in it for the rest of the components, such as provision for some threaded inserts to use as feet mount points later, and the PS5's LED board, which has a couple of holes beneath it for the light to shine out through. It's going to be interesting to see how this will look later on, as they'll illuminate the surface on which the console stands, and I think aesthetically that should look quite good. The fan too can be mounted at this point, though I'm using a grill first to prevent anything from getting caught in the fan blades. Before the main console can be properly screwed in place though, there's something fairly important that needs to be attended to, which is airflow. You see, the fan itself is divided into two halves which independently pull air in through both sides, hence the need for a hole in the base platform. This underside intake doesn't have to deal with as much heat as the top side will, but it's still critical as the air needs to flow through this tiny heatsink on the PS5, which cools its VRMs. A simple way to make sure this happens is to copy Sony's lead and use some strips of foam to direct the airflow. Using similar stuff with an adhesive backing is a great way to do this. Because of these foam strips, air will be pulled in by the fan and it will travel over this steel cover and then exit through the VRM heatsink, just as originally intended. So with that, the main unit can be finally mounted in place. As you can see, the foam strips have sealed around underneath it, forcing the air out through the VRM heatsink, which is just what we want. There's still plenty to do at this point, but it's pretty exciting stuff, as the next step is to work on the most important part of this build visually, the front and sides. For this, I'm going to be using some American dark walnut, which is a lovely hardwood with a rich colour and refined grain structure, perfect for a build with a goal of subtle beauty. Mine measures about 70mm, which is just high enough to fit above the components with a few millimeters to spare. Using one of these cool Japanese miter saws is a great way to get some sharp angled edges for them to fit together like so, with the grain pattern mirroring itself, which I'll be taking full advantage of in just a moment. As the PS5 has some front-mounted USB ports as well, they need to be catered for by making some holes for them in the front piece of wood. These need to be super accurate for obvious reasons, but as the wood is so thick, it's too deep for anything to actually reach the sockets. So I've decided to use the router again, only this time using it to make some indentations so that the sockets can actually be reached. As you can see, I've also made a much wider indentation as well, with the intention here to be using it for a combined power button and port cover, but more on that in a bit. For now though, the walnut pieces can be glued together to make them a single unit, and I found that screwing them to a temporary MDF plate is a great way to keep them in place while the glue dries. As the goal is to have curved front corners, I'm going to use a rasp to gouge off a significant amount of wood, making it smooth with a lot of sanding. Because of the miter joints here, the wood grain flows around these curves and looks even better after adding some natural beeswax and buffing it to a shine, as it enriches the grain of the wood and gives it a much deeper tonality. In comparison to wood oil, it's far smoother to the touch and looks a lot more velvety. Mounting this to the base plate is pretty easy thanks to the utilisation of some brass threaded inserts, after which it's really starting to take shape. As you can see though, the back is still completely open, so it needs some kind of vent and port cover. Not having quite enough walnut left over however, I'm going to have to slice my piece into 2 strips using a plunge saw. This isn't ideal, but it just about works for what I need, as the 2 pieces side by side are just wide enough to cover the back of the console when glued together. While I could cut the vents and ports in this manually, it would take rather a long time, so I'm using my CNC router. Once cleaned up and treated with beeswax, this cover matches the rest of the console perfectly and looks surprisingly professional. It still does need some feet though to lift it off the surface, for which some speaker spikes do the job nicely. Looking good. It's almost ready to use now, but I still need to sort out a cover for the front ports. Now this might be a bit of a controversial decision, but I'm again using carbon fibre for this. I realise that I could easily go with some sort of wooden cover here, or perhaps even a brass one, but tying the build together with just 2 materials seems the most elegant approach. Thanks to a little DIY hinge, pressing the side of this cover opens it up for port access. Pretty cool. So this covers the ports nicely, but how does it function as a power button? Well, earlier I mounted a little push switch to the front piece of wood, which in turn was soldered up to the PS5's original power switch board. This means that pressing on the leftmost side of the carbon fibre strip triggers my new replacement push button, allowing the port cover to also act as the on-off switch. Pretty neat. So with that, the last thing to do is make the top. Again, to avoid introducing too many materials, I'm sticking with carbon fibre here, and to make the fan vent super interesting, I'm using the CNC to cut out a mesh made of hexagons. These look really cool in a grid like this, but to marry them into the build even further, I've also had the CNC cut out some matching wooden inserts, which, when mounted flush, really finish off the look. Now of course, before mounting this top panel in place, some more foam strips need to be added around the heatsinks to direct air through them as it exits the console. As I earlier added a shallow indentation with the router around the edge perimeter, the top panel can be glued to it with a nice flush fit. And with that, the PS5 stealth makeover is complete. As you can see, aesthetically it's the polar opposite of the brass PS5, and it really doesn't demand your attention. However, when you do look at it, the rich walnut creates a warm retro vibe, which contrasts beautifully with the carbon fibre. Seriously, apart from the use of carbon fibre, this could almost be a piece from the 1970s, and while style-wise it won't be to everyone's tastes, I really like it, especially as it looks so much at home in an actual console setup, which is, after all, the whole point. While the cooling solution has been modified somewhat, from my testing it performs exactly the same acoustically, so is likely running very close to spec. All in, I'd say that the goal of making the PS5 not look like a PS5 has definitely been achieved here, and I love how it matches some of my previous projects. It really is a great example of what you can do to customize your own devices, and how you too can make your most creative ideas a reality. Now, I've found this build really fun to create, but I do realise that many of you won't have the tools or opportunity to make something like this happen. Thankfully though, making your own stealthy PS5 is about to get a lot easier, as dbrand, who are sponsoring this video with this ad, have made what they're calling dark plates, which allow you to completely transform the PS5's appearance. The plates themselves are high quality and can just clip in place of the original panels. Being a deep matte black, they give the PS5 a completely different vibe, and I'd say it looks like it means business now. One problem with the original glossy middle piece is that it's always been a horrendous fingerprint magnet and is super easy to scratch. dbrand has solved this as well though, as you can select a variety of high quality vinyl wraps to apply to the middle of your PS5. The one I have here not only completes the matte black effect, but protects the PS5 too. This is definitely one of the most accessible and effective PS5 mods that you can do yourself, and it looks absolutely awesome. So if you'd like to customise your own PS5 with dbrand's dark plates, you can find a link to them in the description down below. And don't forget, you can customise all sorts of devices with dbrand's products, and it's a great way to make them your own and super fun. So I hope you've enjoyed seeing how to make a stealthy PS5, whether it's this one or this one, and I hope that the build process has given you inspiration as to how you might tackle your own projects, no matter what they are. But other than that, I'm Matt, you've been watching DIY Perks, and I hope to see you next time. Goodbye for now.